Hello everyone, my name once again is David Oni. My YouTube channel is David Oni Wiz. Welcome to another segment of intellectual brainstorming and academic excellence. As you all know, this program is dedicated to our students. Today we're going to look at another different dimension of topic, a multidimensional topic as you always know, and that topic is titled nationalism. So today we're going to look at what we call nationalism. What is nationalism? We're going to define nationalism. We're going to look at the stages of nationalism, and we're going to look at factors that lead to the growth of nationalism. And if time permits us, we're going to look at what we call the National Congress of British West Africa, NCBWA. So what is nationalism? There are two types of, we're going to give two different definitions of nationalism today, depending on the perspective of the country we're trying to define it for, or we're trying to look at it from, whether on the shackles of colonialism or the one that is off the shackles of colonialism. So the first definition is nationalism can be defined as an opposition to foreign rule or domination. Nationalism can be defined as an opposition to foreign rule or domination. The second definition is that nationalism can be defined as a patriotic sentiment on the part of a group of people united by a common bond of language and historical experience to assert for their social, political, and economic rights. So we define it again. Nationalism is a patriotic sentiment on a part of a group of people united together by a common bond of language and historical experience to assert for their political, social, and economic rights. Now, when you're talking about nationalism actually started in the 19th century in the British West African territories, but it was effectively quenched, or it was effectively, the British were able to stop it from spreading, owing to the factor that these traditional rulers were not really educated, or they do not know the means or medium through which they can be able to fight against their colonialism. So during the 19th century, it was not as effective, but until the 20th century, with the return of the educated elite and a lot of factors that actually took place at that particular period of time, led to the emergence of what we call nationalism. Now, let us quickly look at what we call the stages of nationalism. There are 4 stages in nationalism which we are going to look at. The first one is what we call act of what? Of protest, of resistance. Act of resistance. Now, when you talk about the act of resistance was actually carried out by the traditional rulers, but because of their low level education, it could not go very, very far. So the act of resistance was actually done or carried out by the traditional rulers to resist colonialism at all costs, but unfortunately it could not go very, very far. Then the second one is what we call protest against maltreatment. When you talk about protest against maltreatment, the protest against maltreatment was actually carried out by the educated elite. The educated elite, don't forget that they were able to travel out of the country. They went to the Western world where they were able to acquire Western education, and that actually served as a weapon through which they could be able to fight against colonialism. So the second is what we call the act of protest against maltreatment. So the first one is that of what we call resistance. The second is what we call protest against maltreatment. Then the third one is what we call, modern nationalism. When you're talking about modern nationalism, you're talking about the total eradication of colonialism. Then the fourth one is what we call, we've mentioned the first one. We said act of resistance. The second is what we call protest against against maltreatment. Then the third one is what we call modern nationalism. Then the fourth one is what we call desire to participate in government. The nationalists, they realize that for them to be able to achieve their goals and objectives, then there's a need for them to be able to participate in government. So one of the weapons they were able to use is the acquisition of Western education. So these 4 we have mentioned so far now. We said number 1, is a act of resistance. Number 2 is protest against maltreatment. Number 3 is modern nationalism. And number 4 is what we call number 4 is what we call what we mentioned so far. Then number 4 is what we call desire to participate in what we call government. Desire to participate in the government. So there are 4: act of resistance. Number 2, protest against maltreatment. Number 3, modern nationalism. And number 4, desire to participate in the government. Those are the 4 of them. Don't forget. And don't forget that we have given 2 definitions of what we call nationalism. We said it's an opposition to foreign rule or domination. They also say that nationalism is a patriotic sentiment on the part of a group of people united together by a common bond of language and historical experience to assert for their political, social, and economic rights. So don't forget. So 2 definitions of nationalism and 4 stages of what of a protest, which we have mentioned so far. Then let us now look at the factors that led to the growth of nationalism. Number 1 is what we call the return of the educated elite. The return of the educated elite actually led to the growth of nationalism. The educated elite traveled out of Africa. They went outside there to acquire Western education. And on getting there, they realized that a lot of development were taking place in those places. And they realized that there's nothing as good as having your own independence. These people actually came to Africa to educate the people on the evils of colonialism, that they needed to resist colonialism at all cost for them to be able to acquire their what we call independence. Then number 2 is the return of the ex-servicemen. The ex-servicemen, before, during the Second World War, there was a belief that the whites were more superior, that they were more sophisticated, they were more advanced than the rest of them. But unfortunately for them, there were, black people were able to participate in this war, and they see white men dying on the battlefield. They saw their blood. They realized that their blood was not quite different from the one that they have. And why should we now be talking about, superiority of the whites over the blacks? So they came back to Africa to demystify that white superiority. They were able to inform their people that all men are created equal, and the same blood that flows in the veins of the black was also the same blood that flows in the veins of the white, so that they were all equal. Number 3 is what we call high cost of goods and services. There was an high cost of goods and services that were being taken from Africa and taken to Europe. And when they were being processed into finished goods, they were brought back to Africa, where they were being sold at exorbitant prices to the people of Africa. So that is exploitation. And the people were able to resist it, that this exploitation must stop. It is not the right thing to be done. Then another factor is what we call discrimination in the civil service. There was actually discrimination in the civil service. The higher post or higher positions in the civil service were actually given to the whites at the detriment of the blacks, and the blacks were given lower position. They were not satisfied with this. There is no differences between a white man and a black man, that all men are created to be equal. And for that reason, Africans should be able to manage their own civil service, not being managed by the whites. So they were able to resist it also as well. So this led to the growth of nationalism. The other factor is what we call the influence of USA and USSR. After the Second World War, USA and USSR became the most powerful country in the world, the most powerful countries in the world. And these people, they were able to condemn colonialism in every spheres. They were not in consonance with colonialism. They did not like colonialism. They were against colonialism. And so for that reason, they were able to give support to the nationalists to fight colonialism out of West Africa. Then another factor is the role played by the United Nations organization. The United Nations organization, or the United Nations Charter, stated that all men are created equal, that all men are equal. And for that reason, there is no difference between a white and a black. And apart from that, the United Nations was able to give financial support to the freedom fighters or to the nationalists to be able to go against colonialism from their territories. And for that reason, that also contributed to the growth of nationalism. Then another factor is what we call the British Labour Party. The British Labour Party was not in support of colonialism. It was against colonialism. The other factor is independence of India in 1947. India became independent in 1947. Africa has now realized that if India can gain independence in 1947, why not Africa? Why is not that Africa can also gain independence? If Indians who have been colonized by Britain for a long period of years can actually gain their independence, then Africa too can gain their own independence. Then another factor, there are so many factors that we can talk about. So many factors. Then the invasion of what? Of Ethiopia by Italy. Italy invaded Ethiopia. There was an unprovocative invasion of what? Of Ethiopia by Italy. This was against what? The United Nations Charter, and this was against what? The right of what? Of all man to what? To peaceful existence. So the invasion of what? Of Ethiopia by Italy was one of the factors that led to what? To the growth of nationalism. Then the role played by what? By the press also. The press were able to write a lot of things against against colonialism. That colonialism was evil, that Africans was able to participate and take decisions on how their government or their country should be governed and how to run their country. Their country must not be run by a foreigner or by a white. Then another factor is what? Is the non-development of the colonies. The colonies that were being colonized by the British and the so-called superpowers or the so-called colonial masters, they did not develop these colonies. They were just busy exploiting these colonies. And because of that level of exploitation, these people were able to resist them. So far so good. We have mentioned so many factors that actually led to the growth of what we call nationalism. Now, let us quickly look at what we call National Congress of British West Africa. Don't forget that, 4 territories were being colonized by the British in West Africa. The colonies were actually number 1, Nigeria, number 2, Gold Coast, which is now called Ghana, number 3, Sierra Leone, and number 4, Gambia. Now, what happened is that, I mentioned the educated elite before. Most of these colonies that have been able to produce, intellectuals or academicians or people that have been able to have access to Western education, most of them traveled out and they became, enlightened. They became educated. They were able to see, what other people could not see. They were able to see that it is imperative for Africa or their colonies or their West African territories to gain independence from their colonial master. So these people, these intellectuals, were able to come together to establish what we call National Congress of British West Africa in 1917. It was established in 1917. National Congress of British West Africa. It was founded in 1917 and it was presided over by the man called Casely Hayford. Casely Hayford was a Ghanaian lawyer. He was a Ghanaian lawyer. Apart from Casely Hayford, we have people like Shingus, we have people like Chief Olua, we have Savage, and so many of them like that. They were all part of this, National Congress of British West Africa. The main purpose of their coming together is to eradicate colonialism and also to facilitate the independence of these colonies. So, in 1920, they were able to meet. In that meeting, it was attended by 40 Ghanaian, 6 Nigerian, 3 Sierra Leonean, and 1 Gambian. I say again, 40 Ghanaian, 40, then 6 Nigerians, 3 Sierra Leoneans, and 1 Gambian. They were able to meet in the Gold Coast, now called Ghana. It was in this area they now decided to stipulate some conditions which they intended to present to the Secretary for the Colonies, which was called Lord Mina. That is the Secretary for Colonies. His name was Lord Mina. So they were able to come out with some certain requests which they were able to present to the Secretary for the Colonies, which was called Lord Mina. That is, Lord Mina was the Secretary for the Colonies at that time. So when they actually went to London to present these conditions or these demands to the Secretary for Colonies, which was Lord Mina. But unfortunately for them, their request was turned down by the so-called Secretary for the Colonies. They did not accept, this request. It was turned down. And when nationalists, they came back to their various countries, they were attacked by the traditional rulers as representing nobody's interest, that they were only representing their own interest and nobody's interest, that they were being selfish. There were so many aspersions against them. They were being antagonistic against them. They called them all sorts of names, that these guys were just talking for themselves and not for the interest of the territories. So that was the challenge they had. But along the line, a governor came up at that time, and the name of that governor was called Hugh Clifford in 1922. Hugh Clifford came to power, as a governor of Nigeria at that time in 1922, and Hugh Clifford was able to fulfill some of the demands of these colonies. He was able to listen to them, and he was able to grant some of their permissions. And one of the basic things that he was able to grant then, which was very, very paramount and very, 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 very important, was the introduction of the elective principle. Now, don't forget that during the time of the National Congress of British West Africa, there was the existence of what we call the Nigerian Council at that time. There was the existence of what we call the Nigerian Council. The Nigerian Council was made up of what? Of the traditional rulers, who, whenever they go to this meeting, they were always sleeping. They were not educated or exposed to that level where they could be able to challenge colonialism. You understand? But when these people, they took over, because of the level of education and education, and also the role that they played, they were able to achieve some of their demands. So, in 1922, Hugh Clifford, who was the governor at that time, was able to grant some of the requests of these people. And we're going to talk about some of these requests now. I'm going to mention them one after the other. Number one, one of them was that they were asking for the introduction of legislative council, in which number one, that is the introduction of legislative council. That is the number one demand they were asking for. Introduction of the legislative council. And out of that legislative council, half will be elected and half will be selected or nominated. That was their first condition. Then number two, what they were asking for, the creation of a House of Assembly. The creation of House of Assembly. Then number three, they were asking for the appointment of Africans as judges. Appointment of Africans as judges. Then number four, they were asking for introduction of higher education. That Africans should be able to aspire to the level of the university. Then number five, one of the requests was the appointment and disposition of chiefs. Appointment and disposition of chiefs. Now, some of the achievement was that number one, it led to the creation of the Ashimota College in Ghana, and it also led to what we call Yaba Aya College and Ashimota College in Ghana today. Then it was also able to lead to what we call limited franchise in part of Lagos, Calabar, Cape Town, Cape Coast, and some other places like that. So you can imagine what this National Congress of British West Africa were able to achieve at the end of the day. They were able to achieve a lot, and this helped to facilitate and led to the introduction of what we call the elective principle and franchise in Nigeria in the history of this country. On this note, we are going to stop because it's getting dark. I can see that you might not be able to see my face very well again because it's getting dark. I just decided to give this video, just continue what we have always been doing. So I remain your loyal servant again. I remain your loyal servant, David Oni, and my YouTube channel is David Oni's Wiz. You can always subscribe to this channel at any point in time. Always leave your like, leave your notification, and also leave your comment so that we can be able to serve you better. Till we meet next time, I remain your loyal, humble servant, David Oni. Thank you for watching. Till we see next time, remain blessed. Goodbye. Bye-bye.